The morning my daughter-in-law told me I smelled like a homeless shelter, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a casserole dish I'd just pulled from the oven for her family's dinner. I set the dish down carefully on the counter. I didn't say a word. I just turned back to the stove and stirred the soup, listening to her laugh at her own joke as she walked down the hallway toward the guest room. The room I'd repainted myself the previous spring, on my hands and knees at 63 years old, because she said the old color made her feel depressed. That was a Tuesday in October, and it was the moment I decided everything had to change. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who I am first. My name is Daniel. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for a firm based in Toronto. The kind of firm that designs bridges and overpasses, the kind of infrastructure that holds a city together, without anyone ever thinking about it. I was good at my work. More than good, if I'm being honest. I retired at 58, which I realize sounds young, but I'd been careful. Margaret and I had been very careful for a very long time. Margaret, my wife of 34 years. She was a chartered accountant who worked part-time from home once our son Michael was in high school. She was the one who first suggested we keep our financial situation quiet, not secret exactly, just private. We'd both seen what money did to families, the entitlement, the waiting, the way people started measuring their love for you in dollars. Let people think we're comfortable, she told me once, over coffee at our kitchen table in Oakville. Not wealthy, just comfortable. So that's what we did. We drove modest cars. We took one vacation a year, usually somewhere in Atlantic Canada, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. We kept our home, a 4-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood near the lake, but we didn't renovate it into something that announced itself. The kitchen was dated. The bathrooms were fine, not spectacular. From the outside, we looked like what we were supposed to look like. A retired engineer and his wife, living carefully on a pension. What most people didn't know, what Michael certainly didn't know, was that by the time I retired, we had accumulated a diversified investment portfolio worth just over $2 million, held primarily in RRSPs, TFSAs, and a non-registered account with our financial advisor in Burlington. On top of that, we owned 4 rental properties across southern Ontario, 2 in Hamilton, 1 in Street Catharines, and 1 in Guelph, all paid off, all cash flowing. Margaret had insisted on buying the first one when Michael was 3 years old. She said it was his inheritance. She said it quietly, to herself, the way she said most important things. By the time I'm telling you this story, the total value of everything we built together was just over $4.6 million. Michael didn't know. He knew we owned our house. He suspected we had some savings, but he had no idea about the rental properties, no idea about the investment accounts, no idea about the amount. Margaret and I had agreed on this from the beginning, and we never changed our minds. I wish I could say the reason was purely wise, but part of it was simpler than that. Part of it was that we wanted to be loved for who we were, not what we had. And as Michael got older, as he grew into the kind of man he became, I understood why we'd made that choice. Michael married Amanda 6 years ago. She was 32 at the time. Sharp-looking, confident in the way that some people are confident not from achievement, but from expectation. She'd grown up in Mississauga, her parents both professionals, and she carried herself like someone who had always assumed life would continue to provide. She worked in marketing, changed jobs frequently, and had opinions about everything. Restaurants, neighborhoods, other people's home renovations, the way I loaded the dishwasher. The first time she came to our house for Christmas dinner, she spent 20 minutes telling Margaret how she would update the kitchen. Margaret smiled and said, "We like it this way." Amanda laughed as though that was charming and impossible to take seriously. I told myself it was nerves. First impressions. She'd warm up. She didn't warm up. The comments came gradually at first. Small things. She'd look at my car, a 2016 Hyundai Sonata, perfectly fine, and make a remark about practicality. She'd arrive for Sunday dinners and find a reason to mention, always offhandedly, always with a little smile, that her colleagues' parents had just bought a condo in Florida, that her friend's father had given his kids a down payment, that she and Michael were stretched so thin with the cost of living these days. I watched Michael during these conversations. He'd look at his plate, Sometimes he'd add a word or two in agreement. Not passionate agreement. He wasn't cruel by nature, my son. He was just weak in the way that some people are weak. The kind of man who finds it easier to go along than to push back, who'd rather have peace on the surface than honesty underneath. After Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, things shifted. The first month, Amanda came by often. She brought food, asked questions, sat with Margaret in the living room while I made tea. I thought, maybe I'd been wrong about her. Maybe difficulty brought out something better. Then the questions started changing. Daniel, have you thought about what happens with the house if things don't? She never finished those sentences. She let them hang. Michael mentioned you have some savings. Have you spoken to a financial planner about estate stuff? It's just, things take so long if it's not organized properly. I just want to make sure you're protected. We want to be involved, you know, as family. Margaret heard these conversations from the next room. One evening, after Amanda and Michael had gone home, she called me to her bedside and took my hand. Her grip was still strong then. She looked at me with those steady gray eyes of hers and said, "Don't tell them anything. Not yet. You'll know when the time is right. And Daniel, make sure the time is right." She passed away on a Thursday morning in February. It was quiet. I was holding her hand. The funeral was in Oakville. The reception was at our house. Amanda organized the food, which I'll give her, she did it well. Michael held together as best he could. There were maybe 60 people in the living room, neighbors and colleagues and a few friends from Margaret's book club, who cried openly and held my face in their hands and said things that were hard to hear because they were true. 3 weeks later, Michael called me to have what he described as a practical conversation. He and Amanda came on a Saturday afternoon. Amanda had a notepad, not a phone, an actual notepad, with a list already written on it. I made coffee and set out some biscuits and sat across from them at the kitchen table where I had eaten 10,000 meals with his mother. "We've been thinking," Michael started, "about the future. Your future. The estate. There's a lot to sort out, Dad, and we want to help." "I appreciate that," I said. Amanda leaned forward. "We've actually spoken to a lawyer already just to understand the process. Nothing formal. But with the house, and whatever savings you have, there are ways to structure things to minimize probate fees, maximize what gets passed on, avoid complications. It makes sense to be organized." "It does," I said. "I have a lawyer and a financial advisor. Everything is organized." A small pause. "Oh," Amanda said. "Okay. Well, do you know what the total picture looks like? Like in terms of assets?" "I have a general sense," I said. "Because with the house alone, I mean, this neighborhood has gone up a lot. You could easily get over $1 million for this place. And if there are other assets on top of that..." "Amanda," I said gently, "I think it's a bit soon for this conversation." She looked at Michael. He looked at the table. "We're not trying to be insensitive," she said, and her voice had changed, slightly still polite, but with something harder underneath. "We're trying to be practical. Michael is your only child. At some point, there are decisions to be made. We just want to be part of those decisions." "You will be," I said. "When it's time." They left an hour later without having gotten anything from me. I stood at the door and watched their car pull out of the driveway, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. The kind of clarity Margaret had been trying to give me for years. The following weeks were the loneliest of my life. The house was too quiet. I found myself talking to Margaret's photograph in the hallway, telling her about the weather, about what I'd had for lunch, about the cardinals that kept coming to the feeder she'd hung in the backyard. I missed her in a way that had no bottom to it. Michael called once a week, usually on Sunday evenings. The calls were brief. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. He said that was good. Sometimes Amanda would get on the line for a few minutes and ask about the estate stuff with the kind of patience that barely concealed impatience. One Sunday in April, I called Michael and asked if I could come for dinner that week. There was a pause just a beat too long, and then he said they were pretty busy. Maybe the following week would be better. The following week, same answer. The third week, I drove to their house in Burlington without calling ahead. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Amanda's car was in the driveway. I knocked on the door. She answered in workout clothes, earbuds around her neck, looking at me the way you'd look at a package delivered to the wrong address. Daniel, we weren't expecting you. I know. I was in the area. I thought I'd see if Michael was home. He's not. He's at work. Oh. I stood on the step. Could I come in for a few minutes? Just to sit down. I've been driving a while. She stepped back and let me in, but didn't offer me anything to sit on. We stood in the front hallway. She kept her hand on the door. Is everything okay? She asked, with no particular warmth in it. I've been a little lonely, I said. It's been a hard few months. She nodded in the way you nod when you're waiting for someone to finish speaking. Then she said, Daniel, I know this is a difficult time, but I think it would really help everyone, including you, if we could get some clarity on the estate planning. Michael has been stressed. It's hard not knowing what to expect. I looked at her for a long moment. Amanda, I said quietly, my wife has been gone for less than 3 months. I know that. Okay, I said. And I left. I sat in my car in their driveway for a few minutes. Then I drove to Burlington's waterfront and sat looking at Lake Ontario. And I thought about what Margaret had said in those last weeks, and I made up my mind. That evening I called my financial advisor, a man named Patrick, who I'd worked with for 19 years out of his office in Burlington. I asked him to send me a full current summary of all accounts. Then I called my lawyer, a woman named Carol in Oakville, who had handled our wills and real estate transactions for over a decade. I told her I needed to make some changes, and I needed to move quietly. What I did over the next 2 months was not dramatic. It was methodical. Margaret had always said that real decisions don't look like decisions from the outside. They look like paperwork. I restructured my will completely. I had already been the sole beneficiary of Margaret's estate, there was no question there. But I now rewrote my own will with specific allocations. A significant portion, just over $1 million, went to the Heart and Stroke Foundation, because that's what Margaret had said she wanted when we talked about it the autumn before she got sick. A trust was set up for a niece of mine, my sister's daughter in Halifax, who was putting herself through nursing school on student loans. The rental properties were placed into a numbered corporation, with specific succession terms outlined by Carol. And Michael, my son, my only child, was left with a house in Oakville, which was worth approximately $1.1 million, and a check for $100,000 held in trust to be released when certain conditions were met. There was a letter attached. I wrote it myself by hand over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. I told him about the portfolio. I told him about the rental properties. I told him what his mother and I had built over 30 years and why we'd kept it quiet. I told him that I loved him, that I had always loved him, and that love was not the same thing as reward. I told him the conditions for the trust, that he had to complete 12 sessions with a therapist of his choosing, not couples therapy, individual therapy, and provide documentation of completion. I wasn't trying to punish him. I was trying, maybe too late, to give him something. The letter to Amanda was shorter. Then something happened that I hadn't planned for. In June, Michael called me on a Tuesday morning. I could tell from the way he said Dad that something had shifted. His voice was different, quieter. And without that careful flatness he'd had for months. He said he'd been doing some thinking. He said Amanda and he had been arguing. He said he was sorry he hadn't come by more, that he knew he'd handled things badly after Mom died, and that he wanted to start over if I'd let him. I sat in the kitchen for a long moment before I answered. I told him I was glad he'd called. I told him I wasn't angry, and I meant it, because I wasn't. Anger had never been the point. I told him I was coming to Burlington on Thursday, and I'd like to take him for lunch, just the 2 of us, and that there were some things I needed to tell him. He said yes. We went to a diner near his office, one he'd told me about a few years ago, and that I'd never been to. He had the soup. I had a club sandwich. It was an ordinary Tuesday lunch in a city of 8 million people, and no one around us knew that the man across from me was about to find out his father was not who he thought he was. I told him everything. Not with drama. Not with a speech. I told him the way I would have told him anything important, plainly, looking him in the eye, not softening it and not sharpening it. I told him about the portfolio, the properties, the total. I told him about Margaret's original vision, about the decision we'd made when he was a child, about why we'd kept it private all these years. He stared at me for a long time after I finished. Dad, he said, Why didn't you? Because it wasn't yours yet, I said. It still isn't, entirely. But I want you to understand what's here. And I want you to understand how it's going to work. I explained the will. I explained the trust and the condition attached to it. He looked uncomfortable when I mentioned the therapy, not offended, just uncomfortable, which was different. He nodded slowly. That's fair, he said finally, and then, after a pause, Is Amanda? Your wife is not in my will in any meaningful way, I said. That's my decision and it's final. What you choose to do with your inheritance is yours. But I want you to be clear about what that means. He absorbed this. Outside, the city moved around us the way cities do, oblivious and continuous. A streetcar went by. Someone dropped a tray near the counter. The waitress refilled my coffee without asking. Mom knew, Michael said. The whole time. It was her idea. Mostly. He pressed his hand to his mouth for a moment and looked out the window. I let him have that silence. It was a grief of a particular kind, realizing that the person you've lost was even more themselves than you knew. He looked back at me. I've been an idiot. You've been influenced, I said. There's a difference. But you're also a grown man, Michael. At some point, the influencing is something you allow. He didn't argue with that. Over the months that followed, things changed in the way that real things change slowly, imperfectly, without a clean ending. Michael started therapy in September. He didn't make a production of it, just mentioned it one Sunday evening on the phone. Amanda moved out of the Burlington house in October. I don't know all the details and I didn't ask. Michael told me it had been coming for a long time, that he'd been unhappy for longer than he'd admitted to himself. He came to Oakville for Christmas, just the two of us. I made a turkey, maybe too large for two people, and we ate too much and watched an old hockey game on television and didn't say a great deal. It was the best Christmas I'd had in years, which said something, I thought, about what Christmas is actually for. I still live in the house in Oakville, at least for now. I've been thinking about downsizing not because I need to, but because the house has more rooms than one person needs. And Margaret and I always talked about eventually getting something smaller near the water. I think I'll do it in the spring. Patrick and I reviewed the portfolio in January. It's grown, even in a cautious year. The rental properties are being managed by a property company now, which takes a cut but saves me from being a landlord at 67. I go to a grief support group on Wednesday evenings at a community center, 2 kilometers from my house. It was my doctor who suggested it, and I resisted for months because I thought it would be uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. It's also the most honest conversation I have each week. There's a man in the group, about my age, who lost his wife last year after a long illness. We've started going for coffee after sessions, sometimes walking along the waterfront, if the weather allows. He's a retired teacher from Burlington. He laughs at his own jokes a beat before the punchline, and makes excellent coffee, and asks about Michael every time I see him. His name is Frank, and he's become something like a friend, which at this age is a thing you do not take for granted. Margaret always said that the hardest part of building something quietly is that you don't get the credit while you're doing it. You only get the credit later, if at all. I think about that a lot now. I think about all the years we spent being careful and deliberate and unglamorous, making choices that no one saw, because the choices that matter almost never get an audience. I don't regret any of it. Not the discretion, not the patience, not the long years of appearing to be less than we were. Because in the end, it filtered things. It showed me what was real. What's real is a son who is slowly, messily, genuinely trying to become someone better. What's real is a house in Oakville full of 34 years of a marriage that I would choose again without a second thought. What's real is a Wednesday evening with people who understand what it means to keep going, when the person who made going feel worthwhile is no longer there. And what's real is this. Somewhere in a drawer in my kitchen, under a stack of takeout menus and a half-finished crossword puzzle, there's a photograph of Margaret on the dock in Prince Edward Island. She's laughing at something off camera. She's wearing a blue sweater and squinting in the sun, and she looks exactly like herself. I look at it sometimes when I make my morning coffee. That's enough. Most days, that's more than enough.